everyone, and thank you for joining us. And a big thank you to those that have tapped subscribed and shared it with family and friends. In this episode, I'd like to welcome Magnus Johnson, an eclectic marine scientist. Hi, Magnus.
Hi, Jim. Nice to be here. A privilege, I'd say.
Thank you. Well, it's very much our privilege too. If I start and just ask you, where did life begin for you? Where did you grow up?
Right. So I was born in Elgin originally, up in the northeast, and then moved around a lot. Dad was in the Navy, and then he was an engineer on power stations and things. And I spent my formative years, as they say, up on the Shetland Isles in Scalloway. And my dad had a small 27-foot scalloper. And he used to do he was working offshore in the oil industry, and then he would do a bit of scalloping or mackerel handlining or taking people out angling. And then after that, I moved back down south to Aberdeen. And then since then, I've moved around a lot with my kind of education. So I did my first degree in Plymouth, and then came back to Aberdeen and did a master's in Aberdeen. And then I went to an unlikely place for a marine scientist, which is Leicester University, where I went. So I did a degree in marine biology, and then I did a master's in fisheries science, and then I went back to Leicester and I did a PhD on the eyes of deep sea shrimps. Probably of no use to man or beast, but it was absolutely fascinating, and I had a really good time learning a lot about deep sea biology. And then I spent some time in Jamaica running a marine lab there, and I was in the Seychelles with the Royal Geographical Society. And then I spent a little bit of time working as a fisheries observer in the South Atlantic. That was a bit of an adventure. And then I came, there was an advert for a job as a lecturer in Scarborough, at the University College Scarborough. And I didn't really fancy it because I thought it was a tiny place, never heard of it. And I took a ride up and had the interview, and I was so relaxed because I didn't think I was going to get the job that they offered me the job. And I was about 33 at the time. And I had to make this decision. It was either go and do a postdoc in Sweden for a year, which would have been another year, or permanent post at university. So I took a permanent post at Scarborough, and eventually it merged with Hull, and now I'm based at the University of Hull, where I'm a senior lecturer in environmental marine science. And I'm now living in Scarborough, which I love.
That sounds pretty exciting, but if I could take you back almost to the earliest days, when you mentioned Scalloway, there's no sport can beat handline fishing for mackerel.
No, no, not at all. It's always too easy when they're running. And I remember, and I tell my students about this. I mean, this is in the days of, you're probably too young to remember this, Jim, but the days of Decca, and you'd look for mackerel, you'd look to see seagulls on the gulls on the surface, looking for, there'd be a whole patch, you got a raft of gulls on the surface, and you know there was mackerel there. And that was, so that's what we did. So we would catch boxes and boxes of mackerel just on feathers. And it's great.
I'm very impressed with your comment there. And I'm just wondering if you're thinking I won't remember it because you don't think I'm old enough. Is that from what you see, how young I look?
That's it, you're a young man, Jim. Yeah.
I can remember that so clear. I can remember when my father, because he's a fisherman all his life, and we would be driving down the coast from, say, Wick to Helmsdale, and broads, we used to call them, and there would be gulls, and you could, in a ring, you could see them out at sea, and even from the road, from the shore, and that was a good sign that the seasons had changed, the water was warmer, the gulls were feeding. And and since then, in a previous podcast with a guy, Kenny McNabb from the Clyde, tells us where his father and them, they were quite poor in those days. And if it was bad weather, they would have a shore job, but they would go for the days that they were ashore. They were driving down by Tarbert, the Milliken Tyre, and they saw a gannet diving, and they turned, went back, and all the boats caught herring. And since then, last year, I was told about, and this is one of the most modern pelagic trawlers in the fleet from Shetland, and they were watching whales and birds on the west coast and started getting their mackerel. So it still
Yeah.
happens.
Still happens, yeah.
Even for all the millions of pounds of electronic and how sophisticated we're supposed to be now. I think it's fantastic hearing stories like that.
So when I went to the Seychelles, it was before the days of GPS, really. And we used to use line of sight markers for our sites where we were diving and putting down quadrats and things. Fishermen still do that. They'll still use a marker on land to get themselves an accurate position when they can see a tree behind a church or something.
Yeah, I can remember when it was all family boats then. I'm going back now to maybe the 50s, possibly early 60s. And they put a deca on board. And it was just the way we see technology now, it was just a revelation. The fact that you could take points and go back to an area that you had fished before without having to take landmarks.
But definitely it was a major change for fishing, I think.
What did your mother and father do, Magnus?
So Dad worked offshore. He was in the oil industry. He was a Shell rep, worked on some of the diving vessels. My mum worked in the fish factory when we were in Shetland, and then later on she was a social worker in Aberdeen. Yeah, steeped in the sea. Yeah, marinated in the sea, I think, at an early age.
Salt in the blood.
Salt in the blood, yes.
So is that when you're almost like your career started in fishing?
Yeah, well, so growing up I'll try a bit of Shetland here, a pretty place like Scarborough, fishing was all around you, and I remember as a kid, everybody wanted to be a skipper. They were the kings of the town really at that time, and all the young lads wanted to go on fishing boats and go to sea and work on those. I think it's something we've lost now, but at the time that was the ambition, and it was admired, to be a skipper in Scalloway. You were admired, you'd achieved something. You couldn't avoid it, and the sea was all around you, sort of walk along the foreshore and you'd hear that ting, 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 ting of the stays on a mast of the little yachts that were pulled up on the shore. You'd hear that. And in Shetland, and especially in Scalloway on the west coast, you're very aware of both the tide and the weather because you can see the weather coming in. And so you're aware of, you could have asked me as a 12-year-old boy, what's the tide doing today? And I'd have been able to tell you, what's the weather doing? I'd have been able to say, it's going to be, we're going to have some wind soon. And so you're very much in touch with nature when you live there, I think.
One of the things reminds me of when I was a kid, my father, as I said, was a fisherman. When you were saying you see the weather coming in, well, more so about the tides. I could say I've learned so much from him over the years and still think back and use it now. He would actually, when we're talking about tides or any of that generation, they wouldn't be looking at anything other than looking up with the moon.
Yes. Well, you're just aware of it, weren't you? You were aware of what was happening all the time.
And if it was planning something in advance or that, it would be, as he often said, the moon was more important to them than the sun.
Yeah. So, but as a lad, I was driving a fishing boat. I was standing on a wooden fish box, to be able to see out the window, So I'd be driving my dad's boat and bringing it in alongside. I didn't recognise how unusual that was because that's just what happened.
I take it that was not that I'm trying to insinuate that you're old, but I take it that would have been, or you would have been using a steering wheel, not a lever.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a twin Perkins 436s or something like that. So sort of, it was a 27-meter boat, and there were 43 horsepower engines, which are tiny compared to nowadays. A steel hull. So the boat was called the Summer Isles, and it used to be the ferry that ran out to the Summer Isles.
Okay, yeah. Well, when I speak about my dad, their boat was 54 feet, and we all thought it was a battleship. and it had a Kelvin 88 horsepower engine.
Yeah, it's nothing now, is it? Compared to
it'd be 2088 horsepower now. Magnus, what's your view on coastal fishing towns and locals becoming fishermen from what you remember when you were younger?
So I think it's really hard, isn't it? I'd like to see government give more support for kids to get into the industry. And so there's a rule of thumb that we use that is that one fisherman at sea that lives in a town supports between 7 and 15 people ashore. And it's that link between the fishing boats and the town is really, really important. And it's kind of, in some places, I think it's being lost because not all the fishermen are resident in the town anymore. And also the quaint villages, like in my part of the world, you're talking in Yorkshire, Staithes, for example. It's a tourist town now. It's a place where people rent cottages in order to stay there in the summer, and it doesn't have that thriving community that it would have had once upon a time. And I think a lot of fishing communities are threatened by that. And they're threatened by the lack of connection sometimes between the boats in the harbour and the community on shore. And I would like to see some support given to encourage young people, men and women nowadays, young people to go to sea and get what can be a really good career. I mean, I speak to some of the older guys that are around and they value the career they had at sea and they made a decent amount of money at it. And you can still do that. And one of the things I think special about fishing is that you can go to sea. You don't have to be able to write a spreadsheet like I do. If you're willing to get up early in the morning and work hard and go out to sea in a February morning at 3:00, you can make a decent living. And I think there's a problem sometimes with schools. I mean, I work in a university, so I'm probably sort of cutting my own throat here, but I think some kids don't need to go to university, but they need to be encouraged to do the things that somebody like a fisherman needs to do. And we need to respect those people for what they can do. Sometimes in education, we're trying to teach a fish to climb a tree, and we shouldn't be doing that. We should be valuing the skills that people have.
No, it's very true. And one of the things, going back to the days we've been talking about, that fishermen did learn when they're at sea, you learn to fix anything because you had to.
Yeah. Well, I'd say it's the same if you're a scientist. If you're a scientist at sea, you can't just pop to the shop and get a new piece of kit or something. You've got to learn to improvise and use what's around you. So I think it's a common skill amongst people that spend time on the water.
Have you done trips sailing with fishermen with your scientist hat on?
Yeah, a bit. So I've been at sea on a range of science vessels, for example, so from a Russian research ship called the Academic Mstislav Keldysh Discovery, and then the boats that used to sail out of Bucky, the Gold Seeker that used to sail out of there from the Scottish office, and that was full of fishermen. And then more recently, I've spent time on some local boats. So recently I've been out with some scallopers sampling plankton, and then I've been out on lobster boats creeling, and I used to spend time on the Huntress, which was the boat that was owned by the Bridlington Holderness Fishing Industry Group when that was still around. So yeah, and I enjoy it. I enjoy being at sea. I think there's something special about that, and I love talking to fishermen. They're my study species, if you like. I always learn something when I talk to a fisherman. Really, always something fascinating.
That's really encouraging, and it's reminded me, Magnus, of a recent podcast we did with fisherman Ian Harkis and the fisheries scientist Jon Christensen from Iceland. And he was just saying, from an Icelandic point of view, he reckoned that going back in the days, I mean, he's almost 80 now, so obviously a long time retired, but he's still very active and involved. But he says that the scientists used to always go out on fishing boats, and then they'd come up with this idea they were going to buy their own ships. The way he put it, they didn't like smelly, dirty trawlers. They wanted to have their own nice, big ships. He feels that was the biggest mistake ever made as far as the fishing in Iceland, because, okay, it was nice, new, modern ships, scientists, but he says it separated them from talking with fishermen, and that was lost.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I once upon a time, I think the scientific community viewed the data that you got from fishermen as dirty data. It wasn't trustworthy. You couldn't trust fishermen because they weren't telling the truth about what they were catching and where they were catching. Yeah, there's probably an element of that, but the amount that you can get from working with industry is so much more. The Bridlington guys had a different model where the fishing organisation owned its own research boat, and they managed to do so much good quality work over time there. And now, of course, up in Scotland, the pelagic fleet's got its own scientist now, and he's a really well-respected guy. He knows what he's doing. He used to work for CFAS, and that's been a game changer, I think. That's really important.
But I think the Scottish Whitefish producers and the SFF, I think they all have scientists
No,
on
yeah.
board with them
Yeah,
now.
yeah. I think that's something that's happened over the last sort of probably 20 years is the professionalization of the representation of fishermen. And I think that's been a real bonus. I think that's a really good thing. You know, the quality of representation that fishermen have now is really good. I'm always saying how the fishing community needs to support their representative organisations like the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, the SWFPA, the NFFO, and their local organisations. They all deserve support because these folks spend a lot of time in meetings trying to help, and they have a skill set that maybe your average fisherman doesn't have, and we should value them for that.
Very much so, yeah. What's your views on the inshore fishing diversity?
Yeah, so there's a real issue around this, and so my knowledge comes most recently from working in off the Yorkshire coast, or working with the Yorkshire fleet. And what we've seen over time, when I first came here in about 2000, there was a whitefish fleet that worked out of Bridlington and Scarborough, and we still had a fish market in Scarborough and an ice tower, and you'd have somebody standing on a fish box doing an auction. He'd have a fag hanging out his mouth, and he'd be selling fish at that point early in the morning. And that's all gone now, and it's we've lost the whitefish fleet in this part of the world. There aren't many people prosecuting fish at all in this area. I spent a couple of weeks at sea recently along the Yorkshire coast, and I didn't see one trawler working between Whitby and Spurn Point. It's all static gear. It's all pots. There's a very successful lobster and crab fishery here, and that's good in some ways, but it's not diverse. And it means that I worry that the fleet is victim to change. So, climate change is a real issue that's coming, and it's going to impact on stocks along our coasts. And if we're only fishing for one or two species, that means the fleet's vulnerable. There's been a drop in recently in edible crab. We've seen drops in numbers. That means the fleet's vulnerable to that drop. And the price drops. You've got to fish harder for just those species. And that's not good. That's not good for the stocks. So I would just like to see more variety offered to fishermen, and it's a problem of legislation. There are other issues as well, but it is very much a problem of legislation that what fishermen are licensed to catch that restricts what they can go for.
Yeah, when you say that about the static gear, I mean, you mentioned from Bridlington to Spurn Head. That's not a big area in global terms. How many pots would be in that area?
So probably over 200,000 in that area. I mean, it's the biggest lobster fishery in Europe, and then there's crabs on top of that. And it's very successful. And the NGOs love static gear fisheries, and they're always talking about how wonderful they are. And it is good. It's a good fishery here. But I do worry that because it's been forced to go down the route of only being pots in this part of the world, and other places as well, every one of those pots has half a kilo of bait in it. And during the summer, it'll be turned over every 3 or 4 days. So that's 200. You do the maths, right? So 200,000 pots, half a kilo of bait, turned over every 3 or 4 days. That's a lot of protein that we're putting into the system. And that has to come from somewhere. And it comes from trawlers, or from salmon farms. So it's one of the reasons why I'd like to see a bigger diversity of fishing. And I remember somebody talking about this at a conference, and I thought it was a really good way to put it. It was a really wonderful scientist called Beth Fulton. And she said, what we need is a broad footstep trod lightly on the seabed. So what she's basically saying is we need a variety of fishing techniques rather than just this kind of dagger-like approach, which is like one fishing technique hammering away at one or two species. I'd love to see a much broader, bigger diversity of fishing.
Well, a recent scientist I was talking to in a podcast, Dave Mackay, he made the point for trawling, for, say, well, as fishermen call them prawns, langoustines. He says that although it looks like static gear's lower impact, he says that it's been, and this is a scientist that has been proved, he used to work in the Marine Laboratory in Aberdeen, and it's been proved that he says actually trawling is better because when they're trawling, it's more males that are out to the holes. So it's predominantly males who are catching, but with static gear, they're catching a lot more females because they'll only come out once a day to forage and feed, and they'll go into the creel and at some cod. So he says from a stock point of view, it's better trawling than static gear.
Yeah, I mean, I would say everything in moderation, and that includes fishing. In the different ways in which. I mean, fishing's a primary food-producing industry. We need it, and we need to support it, and we need to allow for a variety of different ways to catch stuff. So we catch different things. So yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of work on prawns. I used to talk about them being from posh nosh to pub grub, because the small tails are pub grub and the big ones are posh nosh, and it's a great fishery. And actually, if you work prawn grounds, they become more productive. And some people would argue and say that actually we're damaging the grounds in doing that. But I think we have to make a choice. Do we want food? Do we want seafood or not? We need to think about there's a balance in everything. So we need to think about how we treat the prawn grounds and what we do with them.
That same guy, Dave Mackay, goes on to say that he actually thinks that a diver is more efficient at cleaning the seabed of scallops than a dredger. The dredger will never catch more than 20%. It's not that efficient. It'll catch 20%. Then if it goes back, it'll catch 20% of what is left. But he says a diver has the ability to clean it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with scallops, I would like to see rotational harvesting. So you have a box that you're fishing just now and another box that's left fallow, one that you might be seeding. They've done this in other parts of the French have done this, and it works very well, and they get good catches. So you decide this is a place where we're going to fish. So we seed it, we put some young scallops in there, or we just let it grow for a little while and then come back to it every 3 years. And that would be a good way to go. I mean, there's a lot of rubbish spoken about scallop fishing, dredging. There's sort of the idea that if you run a dredge over the ground, it's ruined forever. Actually, there's some ground that's so disturbed by nature anyway. The difference between the impact of a dredge and the impact of nature on the seabed is indistinguishable. Mike Kaiser done a lot of work on this in Cardiff Bay, and his work basically suggests that it's that everything in moderation. In some fisheries, you won't see damage to the seabed.
Another point, scallop fisherman, dredger, I had a podcast recently in Fletcher. This is one of the points he made, is that nothing can allow for Mother Nature throwing a curveball.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So I guess just on this, we're talking about mobile gear and static gear. I mean, one of the problems that we have with static gear is it's very territorial. So lobstermen keep their pots in a particular area and they have their sweet spots, where they like to keep their gear. And sometimes they'll leave their gear in even if they're not fishing because they need to maintain that territory and stop other people from coming in. And that's quite different from trawling and from mobile gear, where yes, they'll have a mobile fisherman will have his secret spot and he'll have a particular tow that only he knows about, that he does, And there's conflict. There has been conflict in our part of the world between mobile gear and static gear because mobile gear will come in and drag away some pots, and that's something we need to think about and deal with and start to find mechanisms where the two fisheries can live side by side. But I'd certainly like to see a bigger variety of the two types of gear being used.
That's interesting. Have you seen any recent change in the way the catching sector is treated by the science community?
I like to think it's improved the relationship between the two. And there are always going to be points of contention between the two communities, and it depends. So the thing is, a fishery scientist is quite a different beast to a conservation scientist. So somebody that's a fishery scientist sees the nature of fishing as a primary food-producing industry that's necessary. Whereas a conservation scientist quite often just wants no fishing to happen anywhere. And I think fishery scientists try to work with industry where they can. Sometimes I count myself as a fishery scientist in part, and sometimes you're a critical friend to the industry, but sometimes I enjoy working with the industry and trying to help the industry solve problems and highlight some of the issues that they are facing at the moment, which are particularly bad in some of the misinformation that's coming from NGOs.
Yeah, I was going to go on and ask you that very point. How do you see the pressure the NGOs are putting on the industry?
Well, they're so well funded. Some of the NGOs you're talking about millions and millions of pounds that are funded in order for them to have publicity campaigns that are trying to basically stop fishing. Compared to, if you think about the reps that the fishing industry has working for them, a couple of handfuls, that's it. And they've got a lot of other work to do as well. So it's really difficult for the fishing industry to fight against very simplistic stories that are told by NGOs, when actually in the real world things are just complicated. I had an article in the Fishing News recently, and the headline was a lie's run halfway around the world before the truth has got his boots on, stolen from Terry Pratchett. And that's absolutely true. So you can tell a really scary, doom-mongering story like there's only 100 cod left in the sea. There'll be no fish left in the sea by 2048. All these memes that you've heard because they make big headlines in newspapers when actually they're either just not true or, I'm pretty sure there's more than 100 cod left in the North Sea, even now, but they make big headlines and they get a lot of coverage. And then as a scientist, you're trying to fill in behind and say, actually, things are just a bit more complicated than that. And there's so many of these stories coming out. It's hard to fight against them.
I always felt there was encouragement in the fact that the people I've spoken to and met in the science community, I'm hearing yourself, like talking with Mike Kaiser. I've been encouraged that the science community has not been taken in by the environmentalists and NGOs. I always feel that's encouraging, but the policy makers and the decision makers, like politicians, well, they're hearing that from the scientists. But I think one of the problems now is even the governments are worried because if they go against the NGOs, they'll take them to court.
Yes,
and fishing can't afford to do that.
Oh no, it's a battle of finance. It's the way in which these very well-funded organisations coming over here presenting a kind of one-sided view of marine conservation and fisheries, and it's kind of this assumption that fishermen don't care about the environment that they work in, and that's just not my experience at all. That if you spend every day at sea, it almost makes me speechless that people have this very kind of narrow view of what a fisherman is, that they're just there to exploit and take from the sea, and they don't have any appreciation of the world around them or the world that they work in. They have massive respect for the sea, and they romanticize about the sea in their own way, and yet we've got people who don't spend any time at sea telling these fishermen how to do things. And I think I loved it. There was a guy, I've forgotten his name, but there's a Shetland representative, Goodland, I think it was.
John Goodland.
It might have been John. But I remember him talking about the difference between stakeholders and opinion holders in the fishing industry. And I loved that. And I thought he's absolutely right. So, a stakeholder has a stake in the industry. They if things go pear-shaped, they suffer. Whereas if you're an opinion holder, you seem to do better when things go pear-shaped. And I think it's a really important thing that we remember that a stakeholder is somebody that has a stake in the marine environment.
That's so true and a great way of putting it.
Yes, I thought it was brilliant. Not mine.
But a fellow Sheltie.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. I think it might have been John.
Yeah, because John was head of the Shetland Fishermen's Association for a lot of years, and also head up the Shetland, the POs, producers organisation. So he's a very prominent figure in Shetland.
I had the pleasure of meeting him recently, and we were talking about his book, The Salt Roads. It's a really good read. It's a really enjoyable book.
What a fantastic read. When you go back to the way they used to put the salt the fish, and when they landed them, they would be on the beaches drying. And it's funny when we say that, Magnus, because I was just making the point. They would salt them at sea. They would split them, salt them, put them on the beaches, and they would dry. And that's obviously going back in history. At a factory in Wick, we tried a joint venture with Icelandic people, 2 saltfish, and we were going to be putting it to the Basque region. In fact, I had some in the Basque area of Spain and the eastern seaboard of America. But we had to stop, and it couldn't work because there was too much moisture in the air, and we couldn't dry them.
One of the great things about saltfish or stockfish is that you don't have to keep it in a fridge or a freezer, and so it's an energy efficient way of storing fish. I had a bit of stockfish in my shed for about 20 years that I picked up in Italy once. My wife wouldn't let me have it in the house because it was too smelly. But yeah, great way of doing things.
Oh, I don't just know if I have a stomach for having it after 20 years, but I've certainly What's your view on offshore wind?
Well, it's a big thing in this part of the world. And so we're dealing with sort of planted wind in this part of the world, turbines. In terms of how it affects the lobster fleet here, it's not massive. It doesn't have a big impact. But one of the problems with that is people have seen that, and we've done some work on it. Mike Roach led on some work that I was involved in, where we were looking at the relationship between wind farms and lobster catches. I mean, basically, we didn't find much of an impact, but that's very specific to this area. And in other areas, it does have an impact. And it's obviously, it's going to stop mobile gear from working areas that they might have worked before. And in parts of Europe, you're not allowed to fish inside wind farms. And as these wind farms march across the North Sea, and we see bigger and bigger. This is the biggest thing that's happened in terms of the biggest change that we've seen in the use of the sea. And as Mike Cohen puts it, the chief executive of FFO, he said, it's basically privatizing the sea. And that's not something that's happened before. Because when you plant these wind farms on the ground, that means that area becomes exclusive. It can't be used for anything else except for offshore wind. And in my part of the world, fortunately, it's not having a massive impact on the fleet, but that doesn't mean it's the same everywhere else. And it's something we need to look at and take care of. And I'm very worried about floating wind farms, which are going to start appearing like off the west coast and things, because I don't think we know how to deal with them. I don't know if I don't think the industry knows what to do about floating wind farms. They're going to be impossible to fish in amongst using sort of the technology we're using currently.
And how would that be different from the wind farms they have now?
Well, so the wind farms we have now, they're just basically planted in the ground, and you can put pots around them, and that's easy. That's basically fairly straightforward to work around. But floating wind farms, when you've got cables and wires, and they cover a bigger area, that's going to prevent fishermen from working in amongst them. One of the big problems that we see with wind farms is every year there's a survey that's carried out to assess the amount of fish that there are, say, in the North Sea. And basically a research vessel will come and it will survey one square, and then it'll do another square. So there are all these squares across the North Sea. And it's what's called a random stratified sampling. And it's where, yes, every square gets sampled, but a different part of the square, a random bit of the square will be sampled. And it means you get an idea of how many fish there are and what species and what the distributions are. When you start planting wind farms in the sea, that will impact on the distribution of fish, because some fish will be attracted to them and some fish won't. And we know that lobsters and sharks are both affected by the electromagnetic field that you find around wind farms. We don't know quite exactly how that's going to affect their distributions. And the other problem we've got is we won't be able to work out, because we can't sample in the same way inside wind farms as we did in the past, because they're in the way. We won't know what is where anymore. And so getting a handle on the distributions of fish in the North Sea is going to be very difficult in the future.
Yeah, the only thing I would pull you up a wee bit on that is I think the area extends a lot further than what you're talking in the East Coast. It's right up round the coast, right up round the country.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm very aware of what's happening here, and that there are developments further. I mean, I know in the Baltic it's going to be 15% of the ocean is covered by wind farms at some point. And when you look at the maps of the distribution of wind farms here, it's very significant. And we need to understand better what the impacts of that are going to be.
Yeah, and there doesn't seem to be any working with the fishing industry.
Well, I think so. I think that's a perspective that may vary depending on where you are in the country. I'd say in Yorkshire, there's been a better relationship between the offshore wind industry, because the Holderness Fishing Industry Group developed a good relationship with the offshore wind industry in our patch, but it's just our patch, and I don't think that applies everywhere. So I think you're right. In other parts of the country, there may be a less effective relationship between the offshore wind industry and the fishing industry. That's something we need to work at, and that's one of the reasons why people need to support their local or their national fishermen's organisations, because they're the people that can put pressure on these big companies to behave themselves.
Yeah, I mean, all I hear from fishermen right round the country is fishing grounds they're losing, nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to a meeting to fund. So I think the Yorkshire coast is where this compensation started to be paid for displacement of fishermen from areas where wind farms were being planted. And there's big sums of money. I remember the first thing, it wasn't actually a wind farm, it was a pipeline that was coming ashore. And the developer was so desperate to get in and to get a jack-up vessel to come in to help with this pipeline. And the fishermen just weren't moving. They weren't getting out of the way. They said, no, we're not moving. And eventually this company got so desperate that they paid out something like £25,000 to every skipper along the coast to get them just to move out of the way, because the jack-up was costing them a couple £100,000 a day, and they needed to get in. And if they didn't get in this window, they were going to be they would be in real trouble. And it kind of started there's a bit of momentum behind that. And so every time there was a wind farm development in this part of the coast, the fishermen would be seeking compensation, rightly, because they're being impacted. So fishermen would be displaced from the area where the wind farm was, and then the fishermen that weren't in that area, if they were close to it, would be displaced by the fact that other guys were moving their gear on top of their gear. So there was a sort of, and there still is, this kind of compensation culture amongst some fishermen. And there was some nonsense in the early days where some fishermen they were chasing compensation rather than fishing. But some fishermen would say, I don't care. I don't want compensation. I just want to go fishing. I want you to get off my grounds and let me get in around, So that's been a major issue in this part of the world.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, Magnus, because that's exactly what I hear from fishermen. They're not seeing it as a cash cow that they can get money out of. They're seeing them going away with their livelihoods and their businesses.
Yeah, I think in the early days it was just one or two farms, whereas now you can see the full extent, and it's a different proposition now, the amount of offshore wind that is developing around the country.
Oh yeah, I mean, in our Murray Firth here, the East Coast, there's one of the best fishing grounds, Smith Bank it was called, and it was one of the best fishing grounds in the east coast of Scotland. It's now all you'll see is windmills. Fishermen can't get anywhere near it.
It's something that we need to work on.
Yeah. Here's a question from our mutual friend, Mike Park. Ask Magnus, is there room for AI in fisheries?
Yeah, I think AI is going to be everywhere. I think especially in research and in trying to understand complex problems like the problem I described around how fish are distributed around wind farms across the North Sea. That's a really difficult issue, and that's something like AI may help us unravel what's happening. I think it's this sort of technology that's becoming more and more accessible, and it may be something that's of use to skippers in the future as a way of helping them work out where they need to be going and what they need to be targeting, how the markets are going to respond at different times of year complex problems are what AI is really good at. But then I do wonder whether AI is ever going to be as good as a good skipper who understands markets and the ecology of the species he's targeting and the gear that he's using and the weather. And I do wonder whether even AI is ever going to be able to compete with a really good skipper. I hope they don't. I hope it doesn't. I hope there's not always a place for a good skipper.
Oh, I think there is always a case for the people at the top of their game. Funny how I always see a good, what we talk about, a good skipper used to be, he catches a lot of fish. When you see them in a pier now, they're businessmen.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, that's something that I guess that's changed. There's a bit of culture that's changed there. And in the past, and the skipper would run the boat and maybe the wife would be the other part of the business. I think that still happens in lots of places. I know there's certainly some cases down here, but now there's been a bit of professionalization in some where they're using companies to supply the boat, do a lot of things, and professional accountants and all the rest of it, whereas in the past maybe that was a job for a person at home.
I used to do a lot of business with boats in Orkney, and the guy that used to supply all their trawl gear and warps and all that sort of stuff, he said any gear they were needing and they were buying, a net or whatever, the skipper's wives would be on the phone ordering it, and he says there's no way I would argue with any of them if they were talking about how to rig a net.
All right. Interesting. Yeah.
How do you go about making a fishing boat research platform if we're talking about AI?
Yeah, well, that's getting easier, isn't it? So you can, AI is being used to help identify catch as it's brought aboard. There's some research being done on the use of AI in fully documented fisheries, where we have a really good understanding of the size and species that are being landed. So yes, I think in many ways, fishing boats are already research platforms. I mean, I remember meeting a guy in Fraserburgh, and he showed me this drawer. He pulled out a drawer in the wheelhouse, and it was full of these books, these notebooks, and he'd kept a record of every catch that he'd ever caught for 40 years. It was, and I was saying, can I have them? And he's like, no,
No chance.
no chance. No. And that was those data that he had are invaluable. And sometimes it's a case of translating the knowledge of fishermen into a language that can be used, hopefully, to help fishermen defend themselves. So, I mean, the pelagic fleet in Scotland now, I mean, a lot of the fishermen's organisations have their own scientists now, but the pelagic fleet in Scotland's got a really well-renowned fisheries scientist who's there working with them and working with scientists and is involved in big, sort of European projects and helping gather data and helping to understand the fishery better. And that's, so I'd argue that every fishing boat is already a research platform. It's just about translating the knowledge that they have into a format that can be used. And it's not used. The worry fishermen have had in the past is that they gather information for DEFRA or whoever, and then it comes back to bite them in the backside, And so it's building levels of trust so that fishermen will gather information. That's not free information. That's work. They've worked hard to get that information. And I sometimes think maybe DEFRA, CFAS need to pay fishermen for the information that they gather. But, there needs to be a level of trust built up between the government organisations and the fishing organisations in order to share data in a way that's safe and secure for the fishing community.
I think the golden word there is trust, because
absolutely, yeah.
My 60 years experience with fishermen, there's none of them frightened of change.
No, I agree. I mean, a good example there of the openness of the industry to change. I did a bit of work recently where I had the privilege of going to, where did I go to? I went to Yorkshire, Brixham and Orkney to talk to fishermen about electrification, about the potential for having electric engines in fishing boats. And they were so giving of their time. I mean, it was hard to get away sometimes. You get somebody just generally talking about fishing, but I'd be trying to get from them about their propulsion systems and how effective they were and whether they would consider moving from diesel or petrol across to sort of a different system, to batteries and electric or a hybrid system. And they're not scared of change. They want to see that there's potential there and it works and it's economic before they jump. That's all, and I think if there was enough weight behind if there was some real weight from government and funding and helping fishermen make changes across either to meths or to electric, then you're right. Fishermen aren't scared of change, and the ones that are often the most successful are the early adopters in a harbour, the ones that will try something new and take a risk, and see if they can make something work.
When you're talking about electrification, have you met Hans Unkels?
Yes, an amazing guy. I remember, I think I was probably one of the people when he started building that boat or developing that boat. I said, it's not going to work, And of course, what does he call his movie that he's made? They said it'll never work. I mean, it was, he's amazingly tenacious and he's really put his neck on the line to make that work. And I think he's a really good example of the sort of fisherman that will make things happen, that will make sure we have a successful industry in the future.
He's certainly a can-do attitude.
Oh my God, yes, certainly. Yeah.
I've actually done a recent podcast with him. He's a real character.
Absolutely, yes. I think he's succeeded at personal cost. It wasn't easy for him to do that.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I don't know if he's just totally got caught. I'm a wee bit encouraged hearing you because he doesn't come over as making it sound encouraging that it's going to be commercially viable and going up forward.
Yeah, not yet. It will. I think it will happen eventually. I mean, we got interested in it because the price of diesel went through the roof and fishermen were starting to panic a bit about what they were going to do in the future. And fortunately, it's come down a bit now, but it's only going to go one way. The price of hydrocarbon is going to increase over time, and people are going to have to think about how they fuel their boats. There's a really good ship's architect who's based in Bucky, I think, Bucky Shipyard, Bucky Design, and they, so they've been looking at methylated spirits as a potential driver for trawlers, because electric engines are never going to work on trawlers, on small inshore boats, it just doesn't work. The amount of battery that you need just doesn't work. But it will work for potters if we can get to a stage where there's a system that is that you can install. At the moment, there isn't a system that you can buy off the shelf and put in a boat. Like a diesel engine, go and buy a diesel engine and put it in a boat and it'll work, But a system that involves a hybrid engine, batteries, and a motor, there isn't one yet, but there will be. And there are people starting to develop. When the price starts to come down a bit and there's some commercially available systems, maybe we'll start to see more hybrid systems. And one of the things that gives me hope is, and it's one of the things I learned from a fisherman actually, was that when I was doing these interviews and he said, these car parks that you get in all these harbours, you know what they're from? And I was going, no. I said, well, it's the old netting areas where they used to mend nets. And so those car parks now are having to develop the capacity to charge electric cars. So they have to have stations in them so you can charge electric cars. Not a big step to go from that to having charging points along the pier side so that boats can choose to charge up electric engine. And, that the idea for a potting boat, as long as you've got 2 hours, this is what I got from fishermen, as long as you've got 2 hours of power to get you home if you need it, then a hybrid system could work really well.
I know that from speaking to both fishermen in both Iceland and Faroe Islands, they've said they've definitely proved it, that even, obviously it wasn't so much electric boats, but it was changing the jiggers and that from mechanical to electronic, and they were computerized. And they've proved beyond doubt a fish recognized sound. And the boats that went electronic, their fishing was way better than the boats that were the mechanical equipment.
Oh, that's interesting. So I worked in the South Atlantic as a fisheries observer for a little while, and I remember the skipper on the boat, Andreas Santiago, who's called, a Spanish guy, and he used to curse because the orca that were down around South Georgia, we were fishing, and there was a couple of orca that would recognise the sound of his boat, and he was a good fisherman, so he would sort of start fishing, and these whales and orca would turn up, and he'd pull his lines up, his long lines that we were using, and we'd move 100 miles, to try and get away from these whales, and we'd get there, and he'd look around, it'd be safe, and he'd put his line in the water, he'd start laying his line, and we'd get up the next morning to start reeling it in, and what do you see coming over the horizon, sort of jumping through the water? The same orca that had been there the night before. They'd followed him because they recognised the sound of his engine.
Wow. That's amazing. That's really fantastic. When you mentioned earlier about the wind farms, what do you think about compensation?
Yeah, so compensation is a difficult issue. I think fishermen should be compensated where they're being put out, not put out of business, but they're having to move from areas where they were fishing previously. I do wish that some of the compensation that's been paid out already had gone into some sort of community fund or to help fund fishermen's organisations rather than being paid to individuals. Because it's something that's, in some places along the Yorkshire coast, if there's word coming that, say, a pipeline's coming ashore, if you go and stand on the cliff looking out to sea, you'll see an empty space, and then there'll be a sort of a mile corridor which is covered in gear, where there's lots and lots of pots. People have put their pots there because they know that they could, not so much now, but in the past they knew that they could get compensation because their gear was in the area where the pipeline was going to have to clear. And we had things like with a boat claimed for compensation, and it was actually, at the time it claimed for compensation, somebody took a photograph of it and it was on a roundabout. It had flowers growing out of it. So it wasn't actually at sea, but somebody had tried to claim for compensation. It's a difficult one. I mean, I just think I'd rather that there was a way found for the fishing industry to continue to work in and around wind farms. I don't think they want compensation. They want to go fishing, and I think I'd rather see that. But where they are put out, then there should be compensation paid to fishermen.
There's a different form of fishing now. It used to be creel fishermen or pelagic fishermen or whitefish fishermen. There's now added to it claim fishermen.
Yes. Well, you know what? They're businessmen, and they're making a living, and I'm not sure you can blame them.
Do you see your future in Bridlington?
Yeah, so I'm getting towards the end of my career. For all my youthful good looks, I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to think about doing other things, and I have always been around the Bridlington fleet and along the Yorkshire coast, and never really got as involved with them as I would like to, and I'm hoping in the near future to get much, much more involved with the local fleet and be around to help and to sort of help them continue to do what they've done. So the Bridlington guys had their own research vessel at one point, and I'd like to help them continue to do fisheries science for their own purposes, and to help us understand particularly what the impact of wind farms is likely to be on fishing grounds around the coast.
So will there be a group formed
Don't know. Well, it's early days yet. Watch this space, really. So I'd like to form a community interest company in Bridlington that will serve the interests of the community and not just the catching sector, but the broader community around it. I'm sort of hoping to secure funding to do that in the near future.
Are you still tied to Hull?
Yeah. So I'm still a lecturer at the University of Hull for the moment.
Well, you'll just have to remember when, as long as you're in Hull, they'll be saying, Where are you talking about? It's in Hull, it's bread.
It is, yes. Brid, yeah. It is, yeah.
Do you see the future of the industry?
I'm optimistic. I mean, fishermen have survived so many, the fishing industry has survived so many tosses and turns and bends and over the years, and there'll always be a fishing fleet. It's probably going to have to change. It's going to have to adapt. So you're talking about AI, that's the new kid on the block. There's new technologies around for propulsion. There's the pressure from NGOs. And there's a change in communities, which I think I'm very sad to see a demise of the sort of fishing community that I grew up in. And you're starting to see communities where there are fewer fishermen around and they're becoming holiday towns, and so all these things are happening, but there will still be a fishing fleet, whether it may not be in the same form that it is at the moment, but I hope there will be. And I hope there will be people around that support the industry in future. No, not just from the industry, but people outside that recognise the fact, like farming, this is a primary industry that produces food, and it needs the support of the public, as not just the support from within the industry.
I think the public in the main do support fishermen.
Yeah, I think it varies depending where you are in the country. So if you live in a fishing community, and this you do. I mean, Bridlington, or Brid as you want me to call it, Bridlington is the biggest lobster fishery in Europe. It's worth more than £10 million a year. So that community, yes, they support that fleet. If you're in Fraserburgh or Peterhead, you can't get away from the fishing industry. So that community supports it. But there are other places where there's less support, and places away from the fishing industry where there's possibly less support. And like I say, like farming, it needs decent levels of support from the public.
One of the most noticeable, I know you might say it's not quite the same, but take it, you'll remember and you'll know about it. Government with the SNP government, that's in Scotland, and when they were led by the Greens, tail wagging the dog as they were called, the Greens wanted them to change MPAs to highly protected marine areas. I thought it was really heartening because the industry was up in arms because, led by the Greens, they were trying to get HPMAs, highly protected marine areas. And Skippinish actually took out a song. It was written and sung by the members. Angus MacPhail and he's a fisherman, and he's actually done a podcast with me as well, and it goes into the details how they came about and making up the song and writing it, and he invited me to their gig in Edinburgh Castle, where the Edinburgh Tattoo is. Now there was, I think it was something like over 10,000 people there, and before this song Clearances Again, which is the name of the song, because they could see it being another Highland Clearances. And they got Mike Park to come on the stage and introduce the song. I thought it was a lovely gesture. And Mike spoke really well. And he started off by saying, on behalf of all the fishers in Scotland. And he got a huge ovation. It was quite encouraging. It was really encouraging. I thought it was amazing, the response he got, before he said the rest of it, but just by saying that he was talking on behalf of all the fishers in the country.
That measure was misguided, I think, to say the least. I think it was heavy-handed, misguided. And this is one of the things that happens when you have what used to be a fishing community and it changes to a community full of the people that have different views of the world from what they used to be in that area, that don't understand the importance of this primary industry, fishing, to the culture of parts of the United Kingdom and of Scotland. And you get these kind of misguided measures. They're probably carried out with the best possible intent. But, I was so pleased to see that resistance against that measure and that they were successful in the end. And I hope that is a lesson for the fishing community as a whole and for communities as a whole, that, you can resist these measures.
Definitely. If I could put you in the spot now, you're at home and you're going to have a nice meal. First of all, would it be seafood?
Oh,
And
yes.
what would you pick?
Oh, well, am I allowed to?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So I spent a year running a lab in Jamaica, and one of my favorite meals over there was saltfish and ackee. And ackee's a fruit that just grows in the Caribbean. That you've got to pick it at the right time or it's poisonous. And it's almost like scrambled eggs. So it's like saltfish with scrambled eggs and rice and peas. And it was an absolutely fantastic dish. And then because I live in Scarborough, I feel like I have some loyalty to the local catch. So I would say a red Thai crab curry is an absolutely fantastic dish. And just to make it that little bit richer, put some lobster in it as well. And then you get that lovely, rich flavour from the crab, and you get the meaty lobster chunks as well. So that would be my choice.
I really like that. Now, I ran my own restaurant for 20 years. And what I'm picking up, you saying that, Magnus, is you're a guy that knows what you're talking about. You know the species, because the number of times I've been asked, what's your favourite, crab or lobster? Now, to me, I love them both. I love the sweetness of the crab and the texture of the lobster.
Absolutely, yeah. They're both wonderful dishes. Crab's nice because it's cheap, relatively.
Yeah, but what annoys me about that, it's a wonderful protein, but it's maybe a bit of work to it and it's messy. But if they forgot, you get the benefit always in the end when you come to eat it.
Absolutely.
Mike, where can our listeners follow you online about what you're doing?
So I'm on Instagram, Acanthophyra, which is the name of a deep sea shrimp from my PhD days, and I'm also on LinkedIn. So if you Google Magnus Johnson Hull, well, you'll find me. There's not many Magnus Johnson, not in this part of the world anyway, not in Hull.
Excellent. Well, I think it's a good time to fold up. And I'd just like to thank you so much. That's some really interesting points, and I'm looking forward to getting it out there and letting people hear your views. Thank you so much, Magnus.
Well, thank you, Jim. I feel like I'm in the company of royalty with some of the fantastic people you've interviewed on your previous shows, and I hope some of my nonsense is of use to someone.
I won't go with the nonsense. No, it's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.